I stood on my own porch with grocery bags cutting into my palms, staring at a lock I didn't recognize. My daughter-in-law's voice came through the door, cold and final, telling me I was no longer family. What she didn't know, what she never bothered to ask, was that the house she'd locked me out of was still mine, and that was the day I stopped shrinking to keep the peace. Ask was that the house she'd locked me out of was still mine, and that was the day I stopped shrinking to keep the peace. I remember the sound first, not her words, but the dull click of a deadbolt sliding into place, firm and final, as if it had always been meant to shut me out. I stood there longer than I should have, grocery bags hanging from my wrists, the plastic stretched thin, my fingers going numb. The porch smelled like rain-soaked wood and old leaves. My key didn't fit anymore. I tried it twice, then once more, slower, as if patience could change metal. When I finally knocked, the door stayed closed. Her voice came through it, muffled but unmistakable. She said my name like it was a burden she was setting down. She told me I was no longer family, and for a moment, I forgot how to breathe. It's strange how the mind reaches for small, ordinary details when something breaks. I noticed the welcome mat I'd bought years earlier, the one with the faded sunflower. I noticed a spider web in the corner of the porch rail, trembling in the breeze. I noticed the clock in my head ticking, counting the seconds it took for my life to split into before and after. I wanted to say something sharp, something that would cut through the wood and her certainty. Instead, I asked where my son was. She didn't answer. I heard footsteps moving away, then silence. I wish I could tell you that this came out of nowhere, that I was blindsided without warning. The truth is quieter and heavier. This didn't begin with a lock. It began months earlier, with love and good intentions, and the kind of hope that makes you ignore the way your shoulders tense when someone enters the room. My son, Daniel, had always been gentle. He used to call every Sunday evening, even after he moved out, even when the calls got shorter. When he married Lena, I told myself the distance was just the natural shift of a grown child building a life. I told myself to be gracious. I told myself there was room for all of us. The house was already too big for me after my husband passed. He died in that living room, the late afternoon light stretching across the carpet, dust floating like quiet witnesses. After the funeral, the rooms echoed. I kept the radio on low just to hear another voice. So when Daniel and Lena sat at my kitchen table, hands folded, eyes bright with plans, and asked if they could live with me while they saved for their own place, it felt like an answer to prayer. I said yes without hesitation. I said yes because I missed my son. I said yes because I believed family meant shelter, not transactions. At first, it felt almost joyful. Lena rearranged the pantry, lining up spices in neat rows. Daniel fixed the loose step on the back porch. We ate dinner together most nights. I learned Lena liked her coffee sweet and her toast just shy of burnt. She laughed loudly at her phone and rarely at me, but I told myself not to be sensitive. I was the older one. I should be patient. I should make space. When she suggested changes, painting the guest room, replacing the curtains, I agreed. The house had been standing still too long. Maybe it needed new air. The first clue came softly. A missed dinner, a door closed a little longer than usual, a conversation that stopped when I entered the room. Lena began referring to things as ours in a way that didn't include me. Our kitchen, our living room. I corrected her once, lightly, with a smile. She smiled back, thin and quick, and said, "Of course," like the word itself annoyed her. Daniel avoided my eyes. He'd always been bad with tension. He'd learned early to keep peace by staying quiet. Paperwork started disappearing from the sideboard. Mail addressed to me was stacked elsewhere, sometimes opened. When I asked, Lena said she was just organizing, just trying to help. I thanked her, even as my chest tightened. I noticed she'd begun inviting friends over without telling me. Music would thump through the walls late at night. I'd lie in bed listening to laughter that didn't include me, the ceiling fan clicking softly above, wondering how I'd become a guest in my own home. One afternoon, I overheard Lena on the phone in the backyard. The window was cracked open, the smell of cut grass drifting in. She said, "Once it's officially ours, things will be easier." I waited for her to clarify, to correct herself. She didn't. When I asked Daniel later what she meant, he rubbed his forehead and said I was misinterpreting. He said she was stressed. He said they were just talking about the future. I nodded. I made soup. I swallowed my questions because I didn't want to be the problem. The night before the locks were changed, I couldn't sleep. Rain tapped against the windows. I walked the hallway barefoot, touching the frames where my son's height had been marked in pencil years ago. I paused at the front door, my hand resting on the cool brass knob, a strange unease settling in my stomach. I told myself I was foolish. I told myself love doesn't count locks. In the morning, I grabbed my purse and keys and drove to the store for groceries, the radio humming low, unaware that the key in my hand was already useless. When I finally left the porch that day, I set the bags down gently, like they might break if I didn't. I drove to a friend's house and sat in her driveway for a long time without going in. My phone buzzed once, a text from Daniel that said, "We need to talk later." I watched the rain bead on my windshield and thought about all the times I'd made room for others at the expense of my own voice. I didn't know yet what I would do. I only knew something inside me had gone still, like a lake before a storm. I spent that first night on my friend Marjorie's couch, staring at the slow turn of her ceiling fan, listening to the house settle around me like it was breathing. She made me tea I didn't drink and asked questions I wasn't ready to answer. I told her only that there had been a misunderstanding. Even then, I was protecting them. Old habits die hard. In the morning, my joints stiff from the unfamiliar cushions, I drove back to the house with a resolve that felt fragile but necessary. I told myself this was my home. I told myself there had to be an explanation that made sense. Daniel was in the driveway when I arrived, his shoulders slumped, hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. The air was cold, sharp enough to sting my lungs. He wouldn't meet my eyes at first. He said Lena thought it would be better if we had clear boundaries. He said they needed space. I asked him if space required changing the locks without telling me. He looked up then, startled, like the thought hadn't occurred to him. He said he didn't know she'd done it that way. His voice was thin, stretched between loyalty and fear. I asked him if he remembered whose name was on the deed. He swallowed. He said, "Mom, can we not do this right now?" We stood there in silence, the house looming behind him like a third party in the conversation. I noticed how different it looked from the outside than it felt from within, the windows reflecting the gray sky, giving nothing away. Lena didn't come out. I could hear movement inside, the faint clatter of dishes. I told Daniel I needed my things. He said he talked to her. He said to give him time. Time had been the one thing I'd given freely, and it had bought me nothing. When I finally got inside later that afternoon, escorted like a stranger while Lena sat stiffly at the table, I packed a small suitcase. She watched me the way you watch someone remove items from a hotel room, detached and impatient. I took only what I needed, a few clothes, my medication, the framed photo of my husband that sat on the dresser. My hand shook as I folded sweaters I'd worn for years, the familiar fabric suddenly foreign. Lena cleared her throat once, as if to remind me I was being observed. I didn't look at her. If I did, I was afraid I'd say something I couldn't take back. I stayed with Marjorie for 2 weeks. During that time, the truth began to surface, not in a dramatic rush, but in pieces, like shards washing up on shore. I found the folder with the deed in my lockbox, exactly where it had always been. My name. Only my name. I called my attorney, a quiet man who had helped my husband and I years ago. He listened without interruption, then said gently, "You have every right to that property." Hearing it spoken aloud steadied me in a way I hadn't expected. It wasn't about revenge, it was about reality. Daniel came by one evening, his eyes red, his voice hoarse. He said Lena felt disrespected. He said she thought I was undermining their marriage by reminding her the house wasn't theirs. I asked him when I'd done that. He couldn't answer. He said she'd been telling friends the house was basically theirs now. The word basically hung in the air between us, flimsy and dangerous. I asked him if he believed that. He hesitated too long. In that pause, something in me shifted. I realized I'd been waiting for my son to choose clarity over comfort. I realized he might never do that on his own. The next step was one I'd avoided my entire life. I asserted myself. I sent a formal notice through my attorney outlining the terms of occupancy they had never formalized and setting a timeline. It was calm, it was factual, it was devastating in its simplicity. Lena called me within an hour, her voice sharp and trembling, accusing me of betrayal, of cruelty, of choosing money over family. I listened. I let her finish. Then I told her this wasn't about money. It was about respect. It was a line she had crossed without asking. Word spread quickly, the way it always does in families and communities. Some people looked at me with sympathy, others with judgment. I heard whispers about how heartless it was to make your own son uncomfortable. I also heard quieter admissions from women who'd lost themselves trying to keep peace. Those conversations sustained me more than I expected. I began sleeping through the night again. I cooked for myself. I walked in the mornings, the crunch of gravel under my shoes, grounding me in my body. The day they moved out was gray and silent. A small truck pulled up. Boxes were carried out without ceremony. Daniel hugged me briefly, his arm stiff, his cheek rough with stubble. He said he was sorry. I told him I loved him. Both things were true. Lena avoided me entirely. When the door finally closed behind them, I stood in the empty living room and listened to the echo. It was loud, but it was honest. I changed the locks back myself. The click sounded different this time, not like exclusion, but like intention. I opened the windows and let the air move through the rooms. I placed my husband's photo back where it belonged. The house felt like mine again, not because of paperwork, but because I had reclaimed my voice. I knew the road ahead with my son would be complicated, slow, imperfect. Healing usually is. But as I sat at my kitchen table that evening, the smell of soup simmering on the stove, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. I felt whole. The weeks after they left were quieter than I expected. Not empty, but settled, like dust finally finding its place. I spent the first few mornings walking from room to room, touching things, reacquainting myself with the house as if it were an old friend I'd nearly lost. The floorboards still creaked in the same spots. The kitchen clock still ran a minute fast. These small, stubborn details comforted me. They hadn't changed, even when the people inside had. Daniel didn't call at first. I told myself that was all right, that we both needed space to feel what we were feeling without performing it for each other. I busied my hands. I sorted through old papers. I donated clothes I no longer wore. I repainted the guest room back to its soft cream color, covering the sharp gray Lena had chosen. With each brushstroke, I felt like I was erasing a layer of silence I'd lived under for too long. When Daniel finally did call, his voice sounded older. He asked if he could come by alone. I said yes, but I felt my stomach tighten as I set 2 mugs on the counter, the kettle hissing softly. He arrived with nothing in his hands, no jacket despite the chill. We sat at the table where he'd once done homework, his fingers tracing the grain of the wood. He told me they were staying with friends. He told me Lena was angry, that she felt humiliated. He told me he was tired. I listened. When he finished, I asked him how he'd felt watching his wife lock his mother out of her own home. He stared into his coffee for a long time before answering. He said he'd felt frozen. He said he'd been afraid to lose her. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't tell him all the ways he'd failed me. I told him about the fear that comes from shrinking yourself to keep someone else comfortable. I told him how easily love can turn into erasure if you're not careful. He nodded slowly, tears gathering but not falling. Before he left, he hugged me properly, the way he had when he was a boy, his arms strong and uncertain. It wasn't forgiveness, it was a beginning. The neighborhood noticed the change. Neighbors waved again. Mrs. Alvarez from next door brought over bread still warm from her oven. She squeezed my hand and said, "I'm glad you're still here." The words lodged in my chest. I realized how close I'd come to disappearing from my own life. I joined a book club at the library. I volunteered twice a week. I filled my calendar with things that reminded me I existed beyond my role as mother, beyond anyone's approval. Lena never apologized. I didn't expect her to. I heard through Daniel that she still believed she'd been wronged. I let that be her story. Mine no longer needed her as a villain to make sense. She was a person who wanted control and certainty, and I had been an obstacle. Understanding that didn't excuse her behavior, but it freed me from needing her to change for me to heal. One afternoon, months later, Daniel brought over a small plant in a ceramic pot. He said he'd found it at a market and thought of me. We planted it together in the backyard, the soil cool and dark under my nails. He talked about counseling, about learning to speak up. I listened, offering only what I could honestly give: support without sacrifice, love without erasure. I sometimes think back to that day on the porch, the bags cutting into my hands, the lock that wouldn't turn. I think about how easy it would have been to accept that version of events, to tell myself I deserved it for wanting peace too much. Instead, I chose dignity. It wasn't loud, it wasn't perfect, it was simply mine. The house still stands, weathered and familiar, sheltering not just memories, but a woman who finally learned that standing up for herself didn't make her unkind, it made her whole. Time did what it always does when you let it, moved forward without asking permission. Seasons shifted around the house, each one leaving its own quiet mark. In spring, the backyard filled with birdsong again, the air smelling of damp earth and new leaves. I spent mornings on the porch with my coffee, watching light slide across the floorboards, thinking about how close I'd come to losing all of this, not through force, but through silence. Daniel and I found a new rhythm. Our conversations became more honest, if a little awkward. He told me about moments when he'd wanted to speak up but didn't know how fear had made him small in ways he hadn't recognized before. I didn't rush him. Growth is fragile in its early stages. Sometimes it needs quiet more than advice. I noticed he stood straighter when he left now. I noticed he met my eyes. Lena remained a distant presence, more idea than person in my daily life. When she did appear at family gatherings, her smile was polite, her words carefully measured. We orbited each other without collision. I learned that peace doesn't always come from reconciliation. Sometimes it comes from boundaries held without anger. I greeted her kindly. I did not invite her into spaces she had once tried to claim without consent. One afternoon, as I was sorting through old photographs, I found one of Daniel as a child, standing in this very living room, grinning with a missing tooth, the walls bare and bright with possibility. I sat on the floor and let myself cry, not from pain, but from release. I had carried the weight of that day on the porch longer than I realized. Setting it down felt like exhaling after holding my breath for years. There were still difficult moments. Holidays felt different, quieter. Sometimes I missed the version of family I thought I'd have. I let myself grieve that without turning it into bitterness. Grief, I learned, doesn't mean you made the wrong choice. It means you cared deeply. I filled those spaces with friends, with laughter that came easier now, with routines that honored who I was becoming. The house changed with me. I replaced the welcome mat. I hung new curtains. I planted flowers that bloomed stubbornly despite late frosts. Each change was small, but together they told a story of renewal. I no longer flinched when I turned the key in the lock. I no longer felt the need to explain myself. Sometimes, when the evening light slants just right, I sit in the quiet and think about how strength can look like softness from the outside, how standing up for yourself doesn't require cruelty, it requires clarity. I didn't win anything in the way people expect victories to look. I simply refused to be erased, and in doing so, I gave my son a model of courage I hope he carries with him. I don't know what the future holds for our family. Life rarely offers neat endings, but I know this. My home is more than walls and paperwork. It's a place where my voice matters, where love is offered freely, not at the cost of self. And every time I turn the lock at night, I do it with a quiet gratitude for the woman who finally chose herself. By the time summer arrived, the house and I had settled into each other again. Heat pressed gently against the windows in the afternoons, cicadas buzzing like a low electric hum, and I found comfort in the predictability of those sounds. I woke early now, not from anxiety, but habit. I watered the garden before the sun climbed too high, my hands deep in the soil, grounding myself in something that responded honestly to care. There were moments when memory caught me off guard, a mug left in the sink that wasn't mine, a scent that reminded me of Lena's perfume lingering faintly in a room she hadn't occupied in months. Those moments still stung, but they passed more quickly now. I had learned not to chase them, not to interrogate my feelings as if they needed justification. Healing, I discovered, is not the absence of pain. It's the ability to let pain move through you without letting it define you. Daniel began coming by more often, sometimes just to sit on the porch and talk about nothing in particular. Work frustrations, traffic, a movie he'd seen. Ordinary conversations that stitched us back together slowly, carefully. One evening, as dusk settled and the sky turned a bruised purple, he admitted he'd started setting boundaries of his own, small ones, saying no when he meant no, pausing before agreeing just to avoid conflict. His voice carried a mixture of pride and uncertainty. I told him that courage often feels like that at first, unsteady, necessary. He asked me once if I regretted sending the notice, if I wished I'd handled things differently. I thought about it honestly. I told him I regretted how long it took me to believe my own worth. I told him the rest had been unavoidable. He nodded, absorbing that quietly. I could see the understanding taking root, not just as a son, but as a man learning how not to disappear inside someone else's expectations. Lena remained mostly silent toward me. When we did cross paths, there was an unspoken truce, brittle but functional. I sensed her watching me sometimes, measuring whether I was angry, whether I felt triumphant. What she didn't seem to understand was that I felt neither. Standing up for myself hadn't filled me with power over her. It had simply returned me to myself. That kind of change doesn't need an audience. One afternoon, I invited Daniel to help me clean out the attic. Dust motes danced in the slanted light as we opened old boxes, uncovering forgotten fragments of our lives. School projects, holiday decorations, letters from my husband, folded and refolded so many times the creases were soft. Daniel held one of those letters carefully, like it might crumble. He said he wished he'd known his father better as an adult. I told him some things you understand only when life forces you to. That didn't mean it was too late. As we worked, I felt a quiet pride, not in myself alone, but in the space we were creating together, one where honesty could exist without punishment. I realized then that the real inheritance I had to offer my son wasn't this house. It was the example of what it looks like to reclaim your voice without hardening your heart. That night, after he left, I sat alone in the living room with the lights off, the moon casting pale shapes across the floor. I thought about the woman I'd been before all of this happened, the one who avoided discomfort at all costs, the one who believed endurance was the same thing as love. I felt tenderness toward her. She had done the best she could with what she knew, but I was someone else now, someone quieter perhaps, but steadier. The world didn't change dramatically after that. Bills still came, the roof still leaked a little during heavy rain. Life remained imperfect and demanding, but there was a fundamental difference in how I met it. I no longer apologized for taking up space. I no longer mistook silence for peace. Sometimes, when friends ask about what happened, I tell them simply that I had to remind myself who I was. I don't dwell on the lock or the words that cut so deeply that day. I focus on what came after, the slow rebuilding, the choosing, the courage that arrived not as a shout, but as a quiet, unwavering decision. And every so often, as I turn off the lights and head upstairs, I pause at the front door. I rest my hand on the lock, feeling its solid weight, not as a symbol of exclusion, but as a reminder. This home holds my past, my present, and whatever comes next. And this time, I know exactly who belongs here. Autumn arrived quietly, the way it always does when you're finally paying attention. Leaves gathered along the fence line, brittle and coppery, crunching underfoot when I stepped outside in the mornings. I began keeping the windows open longer, letting the cool air move through the house, carrying with it the faint smell of smoke from someone's distant fireplace. The house felt awake in a different way now, less guarded, more lived in. I noticed changes in myself that had nothing to do with the house or my family. I spoke more directly with people. When a neighbor asked for a favor I didn't have the energy to give, I said so without wrapping it in apologies. When a clerk made a mistake on a bill, I corrected it calmly instead of swallowing the inconvenience. These were small acts, almost invisible, but together they reshaped how I moved through the world. I had spent so long accommodating others that I hadn't realized how much strength I'd been leaving unused. Daniel invited me to lunch one afternoon at a small cafe halfway between our homes. He arrived early, already seated, his posture more assured than I remembered. Over soup and sandwiches, he told me he and Lena were still struggling. Counseling was helping, he said, but it was slow. He admitted there were days he felt angry, not just at her, but at himself. I listened without interrupting, stirring my soup slowly, watching the steam rise. When he asked how I managed not to hate her, I answered honestly. I told him hatred requires energy I'd rather spend living. I told him letting go wasn't the same as excusing what happened. It was choosing not to let it live rent-free in my heart. He looked at me for a long moment, then smiled faintly. He said, "You're different now." I smiled back and said, "So are you." It felt true. Pain, when faced, has a way of changing people, not always for the better, but often for the braver. Later that week, I received a letter from Lena. Not a text, not a call, a letter written carefully, the handwriting neat and controlled. She didn't apologize outright. Instead, she explained fear, insecurity, a need to feel stable. She wrote about growing up with uncertainty, about how ownership had come to mean safety to her. I read it twice, then folded it and placed it in the drawer where I kept important papers. Understanding her motivations didn't undo the harm, but it softened the sharpest edges. It allowed me to see her as human, flawed and frightened, rather than just the woman who locked me out. I didn't respond right away. I sat with it for days, letting myself feel whatever came up without judgment. Eventually, I wrote back. My letter was short. I acknowledged her fears. I stated my boundaries. I told her I hoped we could move forward with honesty, but that trust would take time. I sealed the envelope with steady hands. Sending it felt like closing a chapter gently instead of slamming it shut. As the holidays approached, I made deliberate choices. I hosted a small dinner instead of the large gatherings I used to exhaust myself preparing. I invited only those who brought warmth with them. Daniel came. Lena did not. There was an empty chair at the table, noticeable but not overwhelming. Laughter filled the room anyway, uneven at first, then easier as the night wore on. When I went to bed that evening, tired and content, I realized I hadn't once felt the urge to pretend everything was fine. It was fine because it was honest. On a cold December morning, I stood at the window watching frost trace delicate patterns across the glass. I thought about how quickly circumstances can shift, how a single afternoon can force you to re-examine decades of habit. I thought about the lock, the porch, the weight of those grocery bags. That moment no longer felt like an open wound. It felt like a turning point, a line I'd crossed into a life that belonged fully to me. I don't tell this story because I want sympathy. I tell it because there are so many people quietly enduring disrespect in the name of love, convincing themselves that patience is the same as selflessness. It isn't. Love that requires you to disappear is not love. It's fear wearing a familiar face. I learned that too late for some things, but not too late for myself. These days, when I sit in the quiet of my living room, the clock ticking softly, the house holding me the way it always has, I feel a deep, steady peace. Not the kind that comes from everything going your way, but the kind that comes from knowing where you stand. I stood on my porch once, locked out and shaken. I stand firmly now with my feet planted in my own life, my voice intact, my heart open but no longer unguarded. And that, more than any legal document or returned key, is what truly belongs to me. Winter settled in fully after that, the kind that makes the world feel smaller and more honest. Snow dusted the steps in the mornings, and I took my time clearing them, the scrape of the shovel rhythmic and steady. I no longer rushed through my days the way I used to, as if life were something to endure instead of inhabit. I cooked slower meals. I read whole chapters without checking the clock. I let silence exist without trying to fill it. Daniel and I began a new tradition of Sunday breakfasts. Nothing elaborate, eggs, toast, sometimes pancakes if we felt ambitious. We talked about ordinary things and difficult ones in the same breath. One morning, as steam curled up from our mugs, he admitted that watching me stand my ground had changed how he saw strength. He said he'd grown up thinking love meant sacrifice without limits. Now he was learning it also meant self-respect. Hearing that felt heavier than any apology he could have offered. It felt like something lasting had come from all of this. Lena came up less often in conversation, which I took as a sign of progress rather than avoidance. When she did, Daniel spoke more thoughtfully, less defensively. He no longer rushed to smooth over discomfort. He let it exist. I recognized that skill. It had taken me a lifetime to learn it. I felt a quiet hope for him, not just in his marriage, but in himself. One evening, during a power outage caused by an ice storm, I lit candles throughout the house. Their soft glow cast moving shadows on the walls, making the rooms feel intimate and alive. I sat wrapped in a blanket, listening to the wind outside, thinking about how many years I'd spent afraid of upsetting others, afraid of being seen as difficult, afraid of losing love if I asked for too much. It struck me then how fear can masquerade as kindness, how easily we confuse the two. The house creaked as it cooled, the familiar sounds grounding me. I realized I trusted myself now in a way I never had before, trusted that I could survive conflict, trusted that I could be alone without being lonely, trusted that my worth didn't depend on how useful or agreeable I was to others. That trust was hard-won, forged in one of the most painful moments of my life, and it felt unshakable. In early spring, Daniel told me he and Lena were taking a break to reassess things. He said it calmly, without drama, as if naming the weather. I didn't pry. I told him whatever happened, he didn't have to choose between honesty and belonging. He nodded, his eyes soft with relief. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give your children is permission to live truthfully. I spent more time outside as the days lengthened, tending to the garden, feeling the sun on my face. Neighbors stopped to chat. New routines formed without effort. The story of what had happened became less central to my identity. It was something I carried, not something that carried me. I could speak about it without my throat tightening, without my hands shaking. That was how I knew healing had taken root. One afternoon, I found myself laughing out loud at something on the radio, the sound surprising me with its ease. I paused, smiling to myself, realizing how far I'd come from that woman standing on the porch, stunned and silent. I wished I could reach back through time and tell her that this wasn't the end of her story, that losing what she thought was family would lead her back to herself. The house stood quietly around me, sunlit and steady, a witness to every version of me that had passed through its doors. I felt gratitude, not for the pain, but for the clarity it forced upon me. Life hadn't become simpler, but it had become truer. And that, I had learned, was worth everything. By late spring, the world outside felt fully awake again, and something inside me mirrored it. The days stretched longer, light lingering in the evenings, and I found myself sitting on the porch after dinner, listening to the distant hum of traffic and the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog. These sounds, once just background noise, now felt like proof that life was moving forward all around me and that I was moving with it instead of standing still. Daniel came by one Saturday morning with a seriousness in his eyes that told me this wasn't a casual visit. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one that had witnessed so many versions of our family, and he told me he and Lena were officially separated. He spoke carefully, as if choosing each word might prevent it from shattering on the floor between us. He said they were both tired of fighting versions of themselves they didn't recognize anymore. He said he didn't know what came next. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. I didn't offer solutions. I told him uncertainty wasn't failure. Sometimes it was honesty catching up with you. After he left, I sat alone for a long while, thinking about how generational patterns repeat until someone is brave enough to interrupt them. I had spent years modeling endurance without voice. Without meaning to, I had taught my son that love meant swallowing discomfort. Watching him now, choosing reflection over denial, I felt a complicated mix of sadness and pride. Change is rarely neat. It often costs relationships before it builds healthier ones. Around that time, a neighbor I barely knew stopped me while I was checking the mail. She said she'd heard a bit about what had happened months earlier. Her voice carried that cautious curiosity people use when they're not sure how much truth they're allowed to touch. She told me she admired how I handled it, how I didn't cause a scene. I smiled politely, but later, as I walked back inside, her words stayed with me. I hadn't caused a scene because I refused to disappear quietly or explode publicly. I chose something in between. I chose steadiness. That choice, I realized, was something many people never see modeled. I began writing again, something I hadn't done since my husband was alive. Just short reflections at first, scribbled in a notebook that smelled faintly of paper and ink. I wrote about the porch, about the lock, about the moment I realized I had mistaken peacekeeping for love. The act of putting it into words felt like laying stones across a river, giving shape to something that had once felt impossible to cross. One afternoon, Lena surprised me by calling. Her voice sounded different, less guarded, more tentative. She told me she was staying with her sister now. She said she'd been thinking a lot about the letter I'd sent. There was a long pause, filled only by the faint static of the line. Then she said she wished she'd handled things differently. It wasn't a full apology. It was uneven, cautious, imperfect, but it was real. I thanked her for saying it. I didn't rush to reassure her. I didn't minimize what had happened. We ended the call quietly, without promises. When I set the phone down, my hands were steady. That conversation didn't mend everything. It didn't need to. It marked a shift from hostility to acknowledgement. I understood then that closure isn't a single moment. It's a series of small, honest exchanges that slowly drain old wounds of their power. I felt lighter afterward, not because she'd changed, but because I no longer needed her to in order to feel at peace. The house continued to evolve with me. I turned the old guest room into a small study, lining the walls with books I'd collected over the years but never fully explored. I placed a desk by the window where the afternoon sun pooled warmly. Sitting there, pen in hand, I felt a sense of ownership that went beyond legal documents. This space reflected who I was now, thoughtful, grounded, unafraid of solitude. Sometimes, late at night, memories still surfaced uninvited, the sound of the deadbolt, the echo of Lena's words through the door. But they no longer hijacked my body the way they once had. I could hold them at a distance, examine them, then let them go. That ability felt like the true measure of how far I'd come. I realized something else during those quiet hours. Standing up for myself hadn't hardened me, it had softened me in the right places. I was more compassionate now, not less, because my kindness was no longer tangled up with fear. I could offer help freely because I trusted myself to say no when needed. That balance was new, and it felt like wisdom earned the long way. As summer edged closer again, nearly a full year since the day everything cracked open, I stood in the doorway one evening and watched the light fade from the yard. I thought about how quickly life can demand courage you didn't know you possessed. I thought about how easily we hand over our power in the name of love. and I felt a deep gratitude for the version of myself who finally said, quietly but firmly, enough. By the time summer returned in full, it felt like a complete circle had quietly closed. The anniversary of that day crept up on me without fanfare. No alarms went off in my body, no tightness in my chest. I only realized the date when I noticed the same heavy warmth in the air, the same cicadas humming in the late afternoon, the same quality of light slanting across the porch floorboards. This time, though, I was sitting in a chair instead of standing with grocery bags digging into my hands. I let that difference sink in. Daniel and I marked the day without naming it. He came by with lunch, and we ate outside, paper plates balanced on our laps. He talked about work, about the quiet relief of living alone for a while, about learning who he was without constantly adjusting himself to fit someone else's expectations. I listened, proud, but careful not to turn his growth into my victory. He needed this to belong to him. Before he left, he thanked me, not for the house, not for the help, but for showing me it's okay to stop negotiating your dignity. I watched him drive away with a fullness in my chest that had nothing to do with nostalgia. That evening, I walked through the house slowly, turning off lights one by one. Each room held echoes of who I had been at different stages of my life. The young wife arranging furniture with hope, the grieving widow learning how to sit with silence, the mother who opened her home out of love and nearly lost herself in the process, and now the woman who had learned, finally, that love does not require surrendering your ground. I thought about how often stories like mine are told as cautionary tales, warnings about trust or generosity, but that wasn't what this was. Not really. I didn't regret opening my door. I regretted not listening sooner to the quiet voice inside me that knew when something felt wrong. Generosity is not a mistake. The mistake is believing it must come without limits to be real. I received a message from Lena that night, just a simple line saying she hoped I was well. No tension, no subtext. I replied with the same simplicity. It felt like a truce that didn't demand closeness, only respect. I was grateful for that. Some relationships don't return to what they were, but they can still transform into something lighter, less harmful. Accepting that had freed me more than any apology ever could. Later, as I prepared for bed, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. The lines on my face were deeper than they'd been a year ago, but my eyes looked clearer. I held my own gaze for a moment and smiled, not of pride, but recognition. I knew this woman now. I trusted her judgment. I trusted her resilience. That trust felt like the most valuable thing I owned. I turned the lock on the front door and listened to its familiar sound, steady and reassuring. It no longer symbolized fear or exclusion. It symbolized choice, the choice to protect what is yours, your space, your voice, your sense of self without apology. I carried that understanding with me as I climbed the stairs, the house quiet and solid beneath my feet. As I lay in bed, the window open to the night air, I thought about how many people might be listening to this who are standing at their own locked doors, literal or emotional, wondering if they're allowed to knock harder, to demand entry into their own lives. I hoped they'd hear this part most clearly. You don't need to be cruel to be firm. You don't need permission to matter, and you are never too late to stand up for yourself. The day I was locked out of my own home felt like an ending. It wasn't. It was an invitation, painful, unasked for, but undeniable, to come home to myself. And this time, I walked through the door knowing exactly who I was and what I was worth. The days after that settled into a kind of gentle normal I once thought only other people were allowed to have. Not dramatic, not perfect, just steady. I learned the shape of my mornings again, how sunlight reached the kitchen counter at different hours, how the kettle whistled a little louder than it used to, how my joints complained less when I moved at my own pace. I stopped rushing through things as if someone might take them away. I began to notice how often in the past I'd lived with a low hum of anxiety, always scanning for moods, anticipating needs, bracing for disappointment. That hum was gone now. In its place was quiet awareness. If something felt wrong, I noticed it sooner. If something felt good, I let it stay without suspicion. That shift alone felt like reclaiming years of my life. Daniel continued finding his footing. He spoke more openly about the marriage, not with bitterness, but with clarity. He told me how much he'd struggled with the idea that choosing himself meant hurting someone else. I told him that sometimes the hurt comes from years of avoidance, not from the truth itself. We sat together in that understanding, neither of us pretending there were easy answers. One afternoon, while cleaning out a drawer, I found the old spare key, the one Lena must have quietly replaced when she changed the locks. I held it in my palm for a long time, its metal worn smooth from years of use. For a moment, anger flared, sharp and sudden. Then it faded. I wrapped the key in a cloth and placed it in a small box, not as a relic of resentment, but as a reminder of what I survived. Not everything needs to be thrown away to lose its power. I started sharing my story more openly with friends, not as gossip, not as complaint, but as truth. Each time I did, someone would grow quiet and say, "Something like that happened to me," or "I wish I'd handled things the way you did." I realized how many people walk around carrying private wounds, believing they're alone in them. Speaking didn't reopen my pain, it transformed it into connection. There was still moments of loneliness, evenings when the house felt too quiet, when I missed the idea of family dinners and shared routines. I let those feelings come without trying to reason them away. Loneliness, I learned, isn't a sign you made the wrong choice, it's just a sign you're human, and it passes more gently when you don't shame yourself for feeling it. One evening, Daniel asked if he could bring a friend over for dinner. A simple request, but one that made me pause. In the past, I would have said yes automatically without checking in with myself. This time, I considered how I felt, how much energy I had, what I wanted. Then I said yes because I meant it. The dinner was easy, warm, filled with conversation that didn't require me to perform or host at the expense of my own comfort. That difference mattered more than I expected. As summer waned, I found myself thinking less about what had been taken from me and more about what I had gained. Not just the house, though that mattered, but a sense of internal authority. I trusted my instincts now. I respected my own boundaries. I no longer needed someone else's validation to feel secure. The lock on the door was no longer the central image of my story. It had been replaced by quieter symbols, a chair pulled into the sun, a letter written with steady hands, a conversation that didn't end in silence. These were the markers of a life reclaimed, not through force, but through truth. I understood now that standing up for myself hadn't closed my heart, it had protected it. And from that protection came a deeper, steadier kind of love for my son, for others, and for myself. That realization settled into me like a final piece clicking into place. As the year eased toward its end, I realized there were no loose ends left tugging at me the way there once had been. Not everything was resolved, but everything was understood, and that turned out to be enough. Life didn't circle back to what it had been before the lock, before the words that cut so cleanly. Instead, it settled into something quieter and more honest, a version that fit me better than the old one ever had. Daniel and I spent a calm holiday together, just the two of us. No forced cheer, no pretending. We cooked a simple meal, burned the first batch of rolls, laughed about it, and ate them anyway. At one point, he looked around the kitchen and said it felt different in here, lighter. I knew what he meant. This house had absorbed grief, tension, and fear, and now it was finally letting those things go. So was I. Lena sent a short message that day wishing me peace. I read it, set my phone down, and felt no urge to analyze it further. Whatever role I was meant to play in her life going forward would be defined by mutual respect or not at all. That certainty no longer frightened me, it grounded me. On the last evening of the year, I stood alone in the living room as fireworks popped faintly in the distance, the sound muffled by walls that had held my entire adult life. I thought about how many versions of myself had stood in this same spot over the years. The hopeful young woman, the tired caretaker, the grieving widow, the mother afraid of losing her child if she spoke too firmly, and finally, the woman who learned that silence can cost you more than conflict ever will. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt settled. I felt aligned. I felt like I was standing in the exact center of my own life for the first time. That feeling didn't come from winning an argument or reclaiming property. It came from choosing not to abandon myself again, no matter who asked. When I went to bed that night, I slept deeply, without the old tension in my jaw, without rehearsing conversations in my head. The house was quiet, but it wasn't empty. It was full of breath, memory, and intention, full of a woman who finally understood that dignity isn't something you demand loudly. It's something you refuse to give away quietly. I don't know who needed to hear this story, but I know why I told it. Because somewhere, someone is standing outside a door that should open for them, wondering if they're allowed to knock harder, to insist, to turn around and choose themselves if the door never opens. If that's you, I hope you hear this part clearly. You are not wrong for wanting respect. You are not cruel for setting boundaries, and you are not selfish for protecting what is yours, your home, your voice, your sense of belonging. That luck was never the real betrayal. The real danger was how close I came to believing I deserved it. And the real victory wasn't getting my house back. It was finally coming home to myself and knowing I would never lock myself out again. Before I leave you, I want to speak directly to you, the listener, in this quiet space we've shared. Stories like mine don't only happen to other people. They happen in kitchens and living rooms and family group chats. They happen slowly, politely, behind closed doors where no one is screaming but someone is still being pushed aside. If you recognized yourself anywhere in my story, I hope you don't rush to judge yourself for staying as long as you did. You stayed because you loved, because you hoped, because you believed endurance was the same thing as kindness. That doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. But here is the truth I learned the hard way. Love should never require you to disappear. Family should never feel like a place you have to earn access to by shrinking yourself. And peace that costs you your dignity is not peace at all. It's just silence wearing a softer name. Standing up for yourself doesn't mean you stop loving others. It means you finally include yourself in that love. If you are facing a moment right now where you know something is wrong but you're afraid to speak, I hope this story reminds you that you're allowed to take up space. You're allowed to ask questions. You're allowed to draw lines without turning your heart cold. And if doing so changes how others see you, that doesn't mean you were wrong. It means the truth finally has room to breathe. Wherever you're listening from, whatever door you're standing in front of, I hope you choose yourself gently but firmly, not with anger, not with revenge, just with clarity. Because when you honor your own worth, you don't just change your life, you quietly give permission for others to do the same.